At the very beginning, I worked with colleagues in Norway, Berger Sorensen, with whom I've been working and developing an HIV vaccine, which actually the phase 2 trials were very, very good. And it was a unique way of going about making the vaccine completely the opposite of all the ones that had failed. So when the COVID sequence became available, he said, let's collaborate and form a group together, and we'll use the same principles to make a COVID vaccine. And then he called me, he said, I'm a bit concerned that this virus is very odd. And so we started to look a bit further, and he came up with the fact that there were at least 6 inserts genetically inserted into that virus, only one of which at any time could really have happened by natural mutation. To have 6 was extremely unlikely. In no time at all, we found evidence of the insertion having been described as far back as 2013 by people in the Wuhan laboratories. And interestingly, it was a group funded by Peter Daszak, who got the money from their NIAID. So when we pointed this out, that this was extremely unlikely to be a random event, because the impact of these sequences was to give the virus a charge, a massive magnetic charge, likening it to a magnet. So it would immediately latch onto the cell and much more likely to infect the cell and establish an infection. And this is what they had been working on under the guise that should this ever occur as a pandemic, they would have insights for the vaccine. But the irony is if they hadn't been doing that work, it wouldn't have escaped and we wouldn't have needed any vaccine.
And had they done any work in terms of developing the vaccine, or had they merely done the work on developing the virus, as you understand it?
At the time, we didn't know anything about any work on the vaccine, but now it is very clear that they were working on a vaccine, and there are reports, I haven't seen the primary data, that Moderna was involved with patents before September. And I'm saying this is just reports, but it does appear that they were working on what you require to make vaccines at that stage.
And perhaps you could explain the inserts to me again, because this is a very complicated point, that when you have a normal virus, a new virus, what do you mean by inserts that may have come from natural causes?
Well, this was basically a bat virus. The majority of it was a bat virus. But they put bits on top by sewing in different RNAs from other viruses. Now, this is crucially important because the people involved sewing RNA, that all came out of an American laboratory, a chap called Barrick.
OK. I mean, this is very important but very complicated.
Yes.
So, in normal modifications, in a virus that jumps the species barrier, you might get one additional piece of RNA that would come into the virus that would allow it to jump the barrier, and this one had 5, and therefore you have to assume that some of them at least were sewn in by a laboratory, that's the only way to do it. Am I understanding you correctly?
That is the absolute right conclusion. The interesting thing about the Barrick, who appears on all the papers, he perfected this technique and he was the best in the world at it. So he was making the inserts for them and giving them to the Wuhan lab then to see if it was more infectious. And then they would do another one and make it more infectious. So that's what was going on. You allude to something which is really, really important. If this had come from a bat to an intermediate, to a pangolin or a dog or something like that, there would have been evidence of this, because when a virus jumps from one species to another, it doesn't come fully equipped to infect that. It jumps back and forward, and you can see evidence of this infection from taking blood samples. Now, they did this in Wuhan, and there was no evidence of any infection before the outbreak. So the virus came out of that lab absolutely primed 100% to infect human cells, whereas a natural jump would have taken ages and you'd have found evidence of the jumping going on for months beforehand.
So within the virus itself, there is a sort of fingerprint that shows how it was developed. There are also questions about the biosecurity at the Wuhan lab, which certainly Matthew Ridley's written about. Are those things that you're concerned about too, or do you think that is not the key problem?
No, I mean, I think that they all contribute to the fact that why it escaped. I mean, and we have done...
But escaped, no one thinks it's deliberate. No one thinks that there was an effort to do this and it got out of control, or that it was a policy?
I think we were very kind saying it escaped, because there were 6 well-documented instances of SARS-1 escaping from really high-security labs, 4 in China, 1 in Taiwan and 1 in Singapore. So it was not uncommon. The thing about the Wuhan lab, it had been inspected and had a woeful assessment of being slapdash and not containing viruses very well, and that it was an accident waiting to happen.
And what do the people who don't agree with this say? What's the Chinese government line? It's saying it didn't happen like this, and other scientists are still saying this didn't happen. How much of a chance is there of that, in your view? Is that a reasonable view?
No, I think it's completely unreasonable. They still keep coming up and saying, oh, they found a raccoon with a very similar virus miles away. But this is all too late. You would have found that in the trail. We know the original virus came 1,000 miles away from a cave. Matt Ridley describes this really well in his book. And they brought it back, and then they started in molecularly sewing it up to try and make it more infectious to the human cells. And that is what they were doing, and they had perfected it at the time it escaped. And there's just no... You would have a trail as long as your hand is... as long as your arm...
All right.
Whatever, but we couldn't find it.
Thank you very much, Professor Dalgleish. Coming up, rows break out over whether an Abu Dhabi-backed firm should be able to buy the Telegraph newspapers, and my panel will get their teeth and their intellect into that. And don't forget, the Prime Minister has seemingly snubbed his Greek counterpart over a row over the return of the Elgin Marbles. We'll be having a debate on that for this evening's denouement.
Who is it?
We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GBNews.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
Affects us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the Wuhan lab leak theory, and you've been sending in your views. Carter says, if the Chinese leaked COVID from the Wuhan laboratory, when can we expect reparations to be paid? And Jenny says, one wonders who that supercilious and condescending lawyer was who chided Michael Gove, quite impertinently and inappropriately, during the inquiry. God help this country from the legal profession, who increasingly appear to be governing us these days, rather than the elected House. Supercilious and condescending. He should keep his supercilium in better order. I agree with Jenny. Many people want to buy the Telegraph, and I don't mean every day from the new standards. They want to buy the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, including GB News' primary investor, Sir Paul Marshall, who has publicly thrown his hat into the ring, along with Lord Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail, and the multimedia group National World, owned and operated by former local World Trinity Mirror boss David Montgomery. Rupert Murdoch apparently wants to buy The Spectator on its own. So it's no surprise that the Telegraph is a popular opportunity for these investors, and any of them would make a credible owner of such a strong franchise. It has a central position in British politics as the Tory party's in-house journal. Its nickname is the Torygraph, after all. Yet does it matter if instead of being owned by individuals or corporations, it were to be owned by a foreign state? The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, after all, is a friendly ally, closely connected to the United Kingdom, not only through government, but also through the royal family. And we have many shared interests and investments at home and abroad. But would it be right for them to own one of the country's most important newspapers? After all, there's no free media in Abu Dhabi, and the ultimate owner and controller would be Sultan Al Jaber, who is a cabinet minister and president-designate of COP28. When I was minister, I wasn't allowed by propriety and ethics to buy a small stake in a Catholic periodical because of the supposed conflict of interest. If that is the domestic rule, could it possibly be right for a foreign ministry to own and thereby control the Telegraph? We know that countries that do not have freedom of speech are much more sensitive to press criticism than those who have a history of it. As William Hague reports in his Times article this morning, the UAE has got upset in the past when our newspapers or television programmes have been rude about them. But would we want a friendly government, even from a democracy, to own an important part of our media industry? Well, with me now, my panel, two very distinguished journalists, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the author and journalist, Michael Crick. Michael, I wouldn't want The Guardian to be owned by a foreign state. I just think it's not the right ownership for a free press, however much one likes the foreign country.
No, I agree with you. I mean, we've had foreign ownership before.
I don't mind that at all.
Kelvin, you know, worked for edited The Sun under Rupert Murdoch. Can't remember whether he was Australian or American at the time. Conrad Black has owned the Telegraph, but they weren't foreign states. And I do think there are serious questions here. I mean, for one, the UAE doesn't share our liberal values. And William Hague in the Times today, in the article you mentioned, talks about how when he was Foreign Secretary, a senior Emirati rang him up and said he had to crack down on the BBC because they'd be saying nasty things about the UAE, and William Hague was having to explain, well, we don't actually have the powers to do that, and I wouldn't want to do it, and all of that. And we've seen what the UAE has done when it comes to football. I mean, I know football is not your thing, really, Jay. At least I assume it isn't.
It's not.
They own a team called Manchester City, who are have been the best team in this country for the last 10 years. But there are 115 charges against Manchester City under UAE ownership of them breaching the rules. And 30 of those charges is because Manchester City refused to cooperate with the authorities. Now, whatever promises are made if they buy the Telegraph, I don't think they can be believed, given the record when it comes to football.
Kelvin, I don't mind them owning a football club because that doesn't really affect elections in this nation or freedom of speech. But I think media is different. Do you think that's fair? Or
actually, if this conversation had been 20 years ago, I'd have agreed with you. Today, I don't think Telegraph matters a damn. And these people are idiots to pay 1.2 billion for a asset which is worth 600 million quid. And this is why they'd be even more stupid. So if they came along and said, after all, the Telegraph's got a long history of supporting Israel, and they said, I tell you what, forget about that. What we're now going to support is a free Palestine at any price, and if it involves taking Israel out, so be it. their circulation, which is almost non-existent right now, would go to nothing. Secondly, their whole business plan would collapse. And thirdly, I would say this: look at other things they've invested in. I'm not a supporter of Abu Dhabi or the United Arab Republic at all. I'm just saying commercial effects would make your argument about free speech a problem, right? Because actually, along would come a Rupert Murdoch. Right, so I encourage, you know the editor of The Spectator, probably reasonably well, Fraser Nelson, a clever bloke. I've encouraged him, don't wait for this bidding to take place, because I think Abu Dhabi will sail through it in the end, right, with various constrictions, right, in the same way as they constricted Rupert when he bought 40 years ago The Times, right. I say to Fraser Nelson, go and see Rupert, who likes backing talent, Piers Morgan being a notable example right now, and an even more notable example was me when he supported me buying Talk Radio and then Talk Sport, right? Go and see him and say, we'll replicate The Spectator, right? He'll take all the talent with him. The Spectator be worth nothing. Honestly, in the world we're in today, individual titles count for nothing. The power is with the consumer, and the consumer, if they don't like your editorial line, they don't like the stories you run, then boom, that business will go bust.
But this is clearly not what they think, because your point there seemed to me so important, that they're paying £1.2 billion for something worth £600 million. Therefore, it isn't a commercial transaction. It is about control.
But nothing out of the Middle East is commercial. After all, they own the Shard, but they don't make you wear a hijab to walk inside it, do they?
Well, I haven't been to it recently.
But Kelvin's wrong, you know. When Rupert Murdoch bought The Times, he made all sorts of promises. The government made him make all sorts of promises, but he broke them. And the same happened when Rupert Murdoch bought various other papers.
I don't agree with you about that, by the way. I would have broken them. Rupert, bizarrely, didn't. He threw out the odd editor who didn't agree with him.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't keep the same editor forever.
Well, yeah, but he threw out, what's his name, Harold Evans, after about a year.
Harold Evans threw himself out, actually, didn't he?
With the say-so of the independent directors.
He threw out Harold Evans for very good reason. Harold Evans was a brilliant editor of a Sunday paper, and the change to a weekly
the promise was
not a success.
He wouldn't do so without the say-so of the independent directors, and I think the history shows that the independent directors didn't give their approval. And he's done the same. What I'm really saying is, if Rupert Murdoch breaks the rules, so will the Emiratis.
Right, so the Emiratis see the issue, not for the UK, which they probably don't give a damn about, right, actually. Where they see the big opportunity is a right-thinking news outlet in the United States. And that, by the way, could be successful. But the Americans haven't got it. So whatever their editorial stand is going to be, it's going to be commercial. They are not going to do things like we support, you know, some vile regime in Iran or something. It is never going to happen. Because they would lose their money.
I'm going to spot it wrong.
I mean, I come back to
not too difficult, that one, is it?
Lucy Fraser, who's the Culture Secretary, but also in charge of sport, she will have seen what happened when they bought Manchester City and how they cheated, and I think she should say to them, you can't buy the Telegraph until you've sorted that problem out. It's corrupted football in this country, corrupted the Premier League. It's not just about one football club, and I think that the two things are linked, because they show a mode of operation.
There's going to be a price to be paid by Manchester City. They are going to be slightly below my beloved Charlton if all this goes through, right? And the same would happen to the Daily Telegraph. 1 minute it's up there, it's all big and fantastic, and if they try and change things or cheat things, they'll be dished. But the other main issue is today the big media barons are no longer the power that they were. The Sun, right, used to sell 4.3 million a day under a great editor, right? They have a fine editor today and it sells about 7.
And if you go on the Underground, you hardly I mean, I read the paper, but hardly anybody else does. And if they do, it's the Metro. They don't read paid-for papers anymore.
No. So I think let them get on with it, and I hope. And if they stick to the rules, then they will be, the rules of covering news in the manner in which it's always been covered, they'll be fine. And if they try and change them and try and support things that the readers don't buy, they will go bust, and they'll deserve to.
All right. Well, thank you very much to my panel. Earlier today, Redbird IMI, the Abu Dhabi-backed firm, issued the following statement when approached about their takeover bid. Redbird IMI are entirely committed to maintaining the existing editorial team of The Telegraph and Spectator publications publications and believe that editorial independence for these titles is essential to protecting their reputation and credibility. We will be introducing a governance structure to ensure that independence is protected. Coming up, could the United Kingdom find itself on a UN blacklist? Hurrah! After a trans row and some lobbying from the usual suspects at Stonewall. Plus, I'll be debating the return of the Elgin Marbles with an historian keen to give away British treasures.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the controversial sale of the Telegraph. And what have you been saying? Lynn says, a disaster to sell the only factual newspaper available to us, a country so aligned with WEF, NWO elite. I know what WEF is, but I don't know what the NWO elite is. The News of the World office. No, I don't know. Anyway, Stuart says, this Telegraph sale is such an overblown story. Print newspapers are a dead industry. They won't even exist in 10 years' time. True. First, the United Nations decided to accuse the United Kingdom of not complying with international law over the Rwanda plan, and now it's considering a special review of our Equality and Human Rights Commission following suspected lobbying from groups such as Stonewall. The special review could see the UK removed from the UN Human Rights Council. It is absolutely splendid to be expelled from such a marvellous council with such distinguished members that have such a fine human rights record. There are 15 of them, and they include China, Russia and Cuba, all of whom have such impressive respect for human rights. This distinguished body appointed the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country that sometimes finds that women get killed for not covering their hair, as the chairman of its social forum. So what does this tell us? Well, Killing women for not covering their hair is acceptable, but acknowledging the realities of biological sex is not. Perhaps we'll be better off without being part of it. Well, with me now is my panel, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the author and journalist, Michael Crick. Kelvin, is there any point to the United Nations?
There seems to be less and less point. If you're a straightforward democracy that actually believes in freedom of speech, various other basic tenets of political life, actually you will not get preferment at the United Nations. When I lived in New York, the general sense there was that America didn't pay for almost anything there, and the whole sense was why are we bothering to have this organisation in our backyard? And I feel like that today. The United Nations never seems to represent, OK, I'm centre-right, anything that I fear. And I wonder who they actually represent anymore, except being a dictator seems to be a massive political plus in their firmament.
Isn't all that matters about the United Nations the Security Council, and the rest of it you can pretty much close down, nobody miss it?
I think the United Nations is important, and if the United Nations was abolished tomorrow, it wouldn't be long before actually we would set something else up, a bit like it was the League of Nations, and you know there is a huge list of failures, but there has to be some talking shop for people of the world, leaders of the world, to come together.
But it doesn't have to do this sort of rubbish, does it? I mean, it's just so pointless.
I would agree, and actually. You have the long list of the tyrannical countries involved in this Human Rights Committee. I mean, at one point, Libya's Gaddafi, weren't they chairman of the United Nations?
And wasn't there about Zimbabwe when Mugabe was still alive being on
And on this particular issue, we need to relax and be calm and understanding and considerate and not have pressure groups and the United Nations and everybody getting involved. It is an incredibly difficult issue. It is only really emerged in the last few years, and we need to think it through properly. And we've got and nobody really has worked out the answer to the whole trans issues. There are some people who clearly do need to change, and others it's more problematic. And we need calmness rather than interference from a world body in order to resolve these issues.
Well, I think Michael's talking great sense for once, isn't you?
Well, there had to
this is
be
the first for everything.
when that happened. I was here when I witnessed it.
I'm very worried. I think we've had breaking news with Michael saying something sensible. Anyway, other news. Amidst the backdrop of more record-breaking net migration figures, provisionally at 672,000 for 2023, the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and fellow GB News presenter, Lee Anderson, has called on the government to place a cap on migration levels. Speaking in the House of Commons earlier today, this is what he had to say.
The people in Ashfield have had enough of this. 7,000 people on the council house waiting list. People struggling to get a GP appointment. People struggling to get a dental appointment. Struggling to get school places. Isn't it about time, Minister, that we had a cap on migration and put some clear divide between us and that lot over there?
Isn't he right that he says people of Ashfield have had enough of it, people of North East Somerset have had enough of it, the people in the country have had enough of uncontrolled migration, and the government could do something about it, and a cap may be a good starting point?
The migration figures are extraordinary. The population at the moment is rising at the rate of about 1% a year. So growth rates of 0.7% are measured per head are effectively negative. We've been in recession for several years when it comes to GDP per head, simply because of the population rise. And in many ways, we can't cope. I mean, people talk about, building at 300,000 houses a year as a target, and that's not even going to make up for what's going on here. On the other hand, I think there are huge benefits from migration, and there are parts of the economy and our social services, social care, that will be even in greater crisis without migration. If you're going to say, right, we're capping it at 200,000 or 100,000, say, then the social services, the health service, won't be able to cope, and nor will many businesses.
I mean, Kelvin, that is the problem. I think we should get to a cap. But I don't think we can go from 675,000 to a reasonable cap in 1 year. I think that is too difficult.
OK, so we no longer have a government which represents a united view on this. So on the one hand, we have Gendrick saying that the social fabric of our country is being damaged by the size of the migration. And on the other hand, on the same day, within a few hours, the Prime Minister says we have the best business visa scheme in the world. They are not completely different, but to ordinary people, these are very dangerous signs. Which one represents the real attitude? So here's the problem. Yes, our health service would struggle, OK? And our care service would struggle. So why don't we deal with those areas which are struggling and say, yes, we will continue to allow them in. At the same time, why don't we force our care homes to actually pay the right amount of money and that kind of stuff, rather than doing what they are doing, which is bringing in people at a 20% discount to the going rate. OK, but that's a small point, but we are going to have to stop it. For instance, we don't have enough doctors. Where do we get them all from? Very nicely, India gives us our doctors. They've trained them up. They give them to us. Why is it, after 13 years of your lot, right, and I'm one of your lot, why is it 13 years of your lot, which would have had that means we would have had 2 tranches of extra doctors in that time, 7 years actually, so it'd be 14 years. Yeah. Why is it we can't have our own doctors? Why is that?
The reason we don't have enough doctors is because the Treasury consults the NHS on how many doctors it's going to need in future, and then sets the cap on the number of people who can go.
So the NHS have got it wrong, and then say we've got to have them from somewhere else. Well, why do we listen to the NHS? The NHS are like farmers. Nothing is ever right.
It's absolutely stupid because there's huge demand for people to go to medical school, and we don't allow them to, even though they're highly qualified, because we have a sort of Stalinist-style model of how many doctors we might need in 7 years' time,
and at the
which
same
is
time,
always wrong.
And we're depriving countries of doctors and nurses who need them even more than we do.
OK, could I deal with one of Michael's points was that we do need people, right? Everything I read, every book I read, even listening to Mr. Musk only the other day, says that AI are going to lead to everybody in the world being out of work, OK? So we should start training up things which AI are not going to be able to deal with, and one of them is going to see, although I've even heard that doctors aren't going to necessarily be needed anymore. Right, but why is it we must work on the assumption that our indigenous people may be desperately in need of work, so why don't we just try and deal with that?
Actually, AI is part of this because remote monitoring and AI is being used in Japan to reduce the number of people you need to look after people in care homes. Right. Because wage rates in Japan are so much higher and they wouldn't be able to afford it at the wage rates they've got. And we've done nothing about this, so we get no productivity in these areas.
OK, can we deal with the Gendrick point, right? I'll be interested in both your views, right? He said that actually the massive migration is actually affecting the social fabric of our country, i.e. breaking down relationships between people. I mean, to be honest with you, in my lifetime, I think we've had a pretty successful run at getting on with each other. Do either of you guys see that as the case? I mean, after all, he's the immigration minister. He should have a decent view of what is happening. Do you see that, Mike?
I agree with you that actually for our lifetimes there's been an extraordinary amount of harmony given, but then the level of immigration in our lifetimes is nothing compared with what we've got now, and compared with what I think inevitably we are going to see in the future as parts of the world, as I've said before on this program, become uninhabitable.
Let me ask you, the immigration minister, do you agree with it that the social fabric is breaking down?
I'm extremely concerned. I think immigration at a low and manageable level is a thoroughly good thing for the country, and it works and people can be integrated. I think when you get 675,000 in 1 year, it's simply too many, and that you have to worry when you have marches on our streets about issues that have nothing actually to do with this country.
I mean, the answer is, as Kelvin says, in some of this, is to pay more. But the trouble is that adds to the government bill, and it adds to the bills of families.
It also gets more productivity. Anyway, thank you to my panel. Coming up, the moment you've all been waiting for, the great debate on the return of the Elgin Marbles. Isn't it about time the Greeks sent their half to the British Museum? That would be a good...
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the UN threatening to blacklist the United Kingdom over trans rights. And Peter says, Jacob, the UN is short for useless nobodies. Well, that allows us to move on to the row over the Elgin Marbles, which deepened today as Downing Street cancelled a meeting between Rishi Sunak and the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis after an alleged breach of an agreement between the two for Mr Mitsotakis not to speak publicly about the artefacts. The Greek Prime Minister reportedly upset Downing Street by claiming that he told the BBC that having some of the marbles in London and others in Greece was like cutting the Mona Lisa in half. The Greek Prime Minister categorically denies that any such agreement of silence ever took place, and another Greek minister said today is a bad day for Anglo-Greek relations. Earlier today, our political editor, Christopher Hope, sat down with the Shadow Culture Secretary, Thangam Debonair, to discuss the Prime Minister's decision to pull out of the meeting.
Happened yesterday, in my view, wasn't really about sculptures at all. It was Rishi Sunak really being quite rude to a Prime Minister of an ally country when he should be and could have been talking about the economy or security or climate change.
So is it time we ended the dispute once and for all? Should the Greeks finally return their half of the precious artefacts back to the rightful home in the British Museum? Well, I'm joined now by historian and editor of Aspects of History, Oliver Webb-Carter. Thank you very much for coming in. Wouldn't that be the easiest solution? The British Museum's looked after the Elgin Marbles extremely well for a couple of 100 years. If they're all united in Bloomsbury, wouldn't everybody be happy?
Well, I would challenge you very strongly that the British Museum has looked after them well for 200 years. The marbles themselves were damaged during a really corrosive cleaning process in the interwar period. And we know as recently as a few years ago, 2021, there was a leaking roof in the Devine Gallery. So To make the argument, I just don't see it, I'm afraid.
But they have been over 200 years pretty well kept compared to what remained behind. That the marbles that remained until very recently, when they had the museum built, weren't particularly well cared for, were they?
Well, the marbles, they certainly weren't looked after, as I've just illustrated, but prior to them being removed by Lord Elgin, he actually took a saw to the marbles to remove part of them from the Parthenon itself. And so in the mere act of removing them and taking them to Britain, that was in itself a destructive act.
But in the times of the day, in the law of the day, what he did was lawful. He had the permission from the Ottoman rulers of Greece, who were the legitimate rulers at that time.
At best, the legal argument is questionable. You say that the Ottoman Empire were the legitimate rulers. Greeks were under occupation. They had no agency in this whatsoever.
But were they? How do you define Greeks? What are they? They're not strictly the descendants of Aristotle either. They're a very different people. There's been a lot of movement of people in the centuries from Aristotle.
The Greek people today are probably the best educated in ancient Greek history, more so than our own pupils, sadly. And so, of all the European peoples, the Greeks are probably more aware of the importance of the Parthenon marbles than any other.
But it's this idea of the people being Greek when they're under the Ottoman rule. It's like saying that the ancient Britons are exactly the same as the people living in the UK today. They're not. There isn't that level of continuity.
I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but I'm saying they have an appreciation of the marbles, and they're a symbol, the soul of Greece.
But they're different people from the ones who were there 2,500 years ago.
I would argue very strongly that the language retains. It's very similar. And as I say again, the knowledge and the appreciation and the importance of the Parthenon is integral to the Greek people.
But is geographical accident a reason for possession against legitimate trade and movement and history? Would you return the Rosetta Stone as well?
I think the marbles are a unique case. And you say an accident of geography. I mean, it's no accident that the marbles were removed from Athens. And the sad and tragic thing is that their current residence in the British Museum culturally is a tragedy, really, because the marbles are all over the place. They're not in the order that they were in the Parthenon. And we have a wonderful building in Athens where they can be returned and placed in their glory and in their cultural, where they should be placed from an aesthetic standpoint.
But I just wonder where you stop with this and why you should say the Elgin Marbles are the exception. That actually history develops and things move and items don't remain where they were when they were created, and that's perfectly reasonable.
I think the Parthenon marbles, as I mentioned before, is so integral to the Greek people. And I think historically Britain has kept the marbles, but we've moved on now. Athens attracts many more tourists to the city than it did even 20, 30 years ago. You have direct flights from America now. This is something that the museum, the Acropolis Museum itself, the way it's placed, overlooking the Acropolis, you can see the marbles in their position and also look at the Acropolis almost at the same time. You have that gorgeous Mediterranean sun. The marbles in the Divine Gallery now are There's no windows. It's rather.
You can't expect the British weather in Bloomsbury to compete with the weather in Athens. They'd need to move to Somerset if you want the best weather, as I tell people every night.
Well, it does sound like you're beginning to agree with me, and they should be returned to a nice.
I wouldn't return
climate.
them. I might be tempted if they were actually going to put them back in the Parthenon, but they're unfortunately not going to do that. But thank you very much, Oliver. And finally, how to keep yourself healthy over the festive season. According to one follower of Christ, and I've got an example here with me. If you can see it, I've got a rosary with me. Praying the rosary in Latin has some miraculous health benefits. According to the Catholic Herald's Philip Campbell, when the rosary is said vocally in the official language of the Church, that is Latin, it slows the breathing down to around 6 breaths per minute, almost the exact same time as the endogenous circulatory rhythms. This is known to have a calming effect on the mind and the body. If there weren't already a plethora of spiritual benefits enticing you to recite the most powerful Marian intercession on a regular basis, this should convince you. Look after yourself, say the rosary out loud in Latin, and it will make you healthier, and you'll get eternal life into the bargain. Anyway, thank you again. Oliver, that's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Are you going to be saying the rosary in Latin this evening?
Well, I'll give it a go, Jacob, but I'm a bit preoccupied by some very strange things that appear to be taking place on I'm a Celebrity. Yesterday, we had the inside scoop about them allegedly trying to airbrush Nigel out of the show. Well, the plot thickens. We'll be going down under very shortly. We're also going to be picking apart Omid Scobie's new book as well, Endgame. But is it the endgame for him? And all of tomorrow's front pages today. What's not to love?
Well, I don't know about that. I tried watching I'm a Celebrity last night after I'd finished this programme. It's the most boring thing I've ever watched on television. It's dire. Nothing happens, and there are people one's never heard of other than Nigel.
Yes, absolutely. The only thing that might liven it up a little bit is when Animal Rebellion inevitably storm into the camp and stop them eating live things on telly. But we still await their presence.
Well, it all sounds very exciting, but we're going to have the weather coming up in a moment. I'm Rees-Mogg. I'm back at 8 o'clock tomorrow. As I've already mentioned, the sun will be shining in Somerset and the Elgin Marbles should go there, perhaps to West Harptree.
Evening, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. The cold weather continues. Quite a few of us having a frosty start tomorrow morning, and for some there'll be some sleet and snow around as well. This area of low pressure just edging down through the North Sea, bringing some gusty winds, but also bringing more showers to northern Scotland and down the eastern side into northeast England, southeast Scotland. 1 or 2 sleet and snow showers may produce a covering through the night, and it could turn icy as temperatures plummet. A few rain showers scattered over the Midlands, Wales, southwest England. A bit more cloud here may just prevent a frost, but really from the Midlands northwards, many areas will be below freezing, rural spots well below freezing, and hence why it could be icy still. Well, we've got these showers coming in tomorrow over northern, northeastern Scotland, southeast Scotland, northeast England. Again, some sleet and snow is likely for a time. The cloud in the south should tend to break up, and so for many it'll be a day of sparkling sunshine, but it will be a cold feeling day. 2 or 3 for many across the north, maybe 5, 6 or 7, and perhaps a little higher in the far southwest. Milder air nudging back in here on Thursday, bringing some wet weather, damp and drizzly. The possibility of some sleet and snow, mostly over the moors in the southwest. Further wintry showers in parts of the east. Again, it could be icy first thing in the morning. But again, for many, it's a dry and a bright day, but it will again be on the cold side with temperatures mostly around 3 or 4 Celsius.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters